Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the most exciting session of our series, at least in my view. It is my pleasure to welcome you to session 4 of the Proposal Development Playbook, where we are finally crossing the bridge from the science of writing, let's call it, to the reality of award acceptance. Up until now, we've talked about the pre-award grind, the registrations, the portals, and even how to handle it when the answer is no. But today, things are different as we are assuming the best case scenario that you've been funded. Our goal today is to transition you smoothly from the submission mindset to the management mindset, ensuring you have the tools to engage constructively with your finance colleagues and maintain a healthy project. On that note, let's begin. So you've been funded. What are your first steps? Once you receive that official email notification, you're often wondering, what are we doing now? So first, you want to think about that we must revisit a fundamental policy premise and one that we covered in session 1, which is the institution is the grantee. Federal agencies like the National Science Foundation or the U.S. Department of Justice award grants to your college or university, not to you personally. This means your institution is the legal entity that assumes all fiscal and legal responsibility for the award. Again, I like to think of this as a kind of partnership model, a kind of shared success, if you will. And that a successful post-award management, it is a kind of dance between your technical vision and the institution's compliance framework. Before you can spend a single cent, there is what's called an official award acceptance. Your AOR must perform a final review and provide a legal sign-off to bind the school to the federal terms and conditions. I should pause and note that this is especially important now, and when I say now, I mean in any transition from one administration to another on the federal level. There is oftentimes a review in terms of various uh, federal rules and regulations and things of that nature. And sometimes those changes are reflected in, at least in the grants world, these terms and conditions. And so it's worth reflecting and pausing and reflecting on what some of these terms and conditions might bind you to. Some are more prosaic, some are more fundamental. And so you'll want to have again, your great team of allies in the Office of Sponsored Programs, most typically, to take a look and make sure that when you accept an award, you understand the full scope of what you are accepting. So while the OSP staff and the post-award staff handle the legalities, your first job is to establish your digital access. Log into systems like, let's say, Just Grants for DOJ Awards or research.gov for the National Science Foundation to view your award documents and, more importantly, your reporting schedules, right? Because remember that oftentimes with federal grants, you're not only receiving the funding, but you're also reporting on throughout what we call the project period of performance on how you're doing in terms of the goals that you stated in the proposal and how you're actually making good on those promises to the federal government. And there are different ways of doing this. And so in your award documentation, you'll have more concrete steps in terms of what those reporting schedules will end up being. Okay, we come back to your campus support team, and you're at this point in our presentations, you'll be familiar with some of these terms again. But let's go back to the Office of Sponsored Programs. So you might feel like the weight of the project is on your shoulders, but you actually have a dedicated team of at the elbow allies on campus, right? So again, your Office of Sponsored Programs, it's not only there to help you with pre-award business, but also with post-award, as we're calling this now. And again, they help you to both accept a grant formally, to negotiate the contract, but then also to make sure you're in compliance with administrative law and regulation. So again, your Office of Sponsored Programs, it is your central hub. They are the expert in these areas, and they will help ensure that you stay on the right side of federal law. Then you have, let's call them research administration hub managers. These can be department grants managers or however your institution is arranged. These individuals serve as your primary liaison, helping you navigate university level support for both financial and project management. Remember that you're going to be thinking about not only how you access the money, but how you hire people. What are ways in which that you can post jobs, right, that are stem from the funding that you receive here, things of that nature. Again, your research administration team is not only helping you with the award end of it, which is very important, but also with these practicalities that I'm mentioning here. And so what are some additional practical notes that we want to think about? So again, we come back to the departmental research administrator that focuses on finance. They are your day-to-day partners for purchasing supplies, managing travel expenditures, and reconciling every individual expense back to your award amount, right? So use these, get to know these people. If you don't already, I imagine you probably do in many cases. But again, these are people that are going to help you be able to not only access the funds, but just as importantly, to account for them, to know what dollars are going in and what dollars are going out. One other concept that we want to refer back to and that your department research administrator can help you with is the concept of effort. Now, this role is really critical. They ensure that the personnel named in your proposal are correctly assigned to the project and that their effort or the time they spend on the research is accurately reported and certified. So again, the reports that you submit are both programmatic in nature in that you're explaining in terms of the program that you've proposed, how you're actually fulfilling the goals that you outlined there, but that you're also, and this is more reflective in the budget, in terms of how much effort the folks that you hire, but also yourself, how much effort you're actually putting into the grant, which is expressed in budgetary terms, they refer to it as person months. But again, you want to make sure that that effort that you propose is actually in line with what you've done. And so again, these administrators are going to help you to accurately reflect that in the reports that you'll send out. So let's talk about the budget and specifically how we revise or modify the budget throughout the course of the project period of performance. So as every researcher knows, what you planned on paper, maybe even as far back as 2, 3, 4 years ago, might not be what you need today. So this leads us to budget revisions and modifications. So let's look back at federal policy, right? So specifically in 2 CFR 200, specifically the provision is 200.308. It dictates that you must report any deviations from your original proposed budget or project scope to your finance team and the agency, right? So what are the three elements that you want to make sure you're uh, when you're asking for a revision, what are the reasons that might kickstart said revision? So a change in scope, right? Um, so again, and I should know before I get into these elements that this is prior written approval from the federal agency, right? So in this case, the first is a change in scope, which is to say any revision to your primary project objectives. The second is key personnel changes, such as you may have to replace a PI or other staff named in the award. And the third is a PI absence, so defined as some sort of disengagement from the project for more than 3 months or a 25% reduction in your time devoted to the project as the PI, right? So these three elements are really, when we think of triggers for a prior written approval, those are the big ones. So keep those in mind. So a change in scope, a change of personnel, or a change in terms of the PI's ability to be present for the project. So the best way to handle this is through constructive engagement, right? So schedule regular meetings with your departmental administrator, especially the one focused on finance, to review your budget status and ensure every cost remains, again, you'll remember this from previous presentations, but that your costs remain allowable, reasonable, and allocable under federal uniform guidance, right? So not only are you trying to properly communicate these modifications to your original budget, but you also want to make sure that those changes are also compliant under federal guidance. Again, presumably most of you have staff that will at least be able to help you come to these conclusions. Okay, so moving on, we want to talk about reporting responsibilities, right? So let's first talk about reporting, which is your primary way of communicating success to the funder. It is vital to distinguish between performance reports and financial reports. While your finance colleagues usually handle the fiscal data, you, the principal investigator, are solely responsible for the technical science and the narrative of your project's performance. The reporting life cycle is pretty strict. So for most recipients, final reports are due no later than 120 calendar days after the period of performance ends. Annual or quarterly updates will be submitted through portals like, as we mentioned before, Just Grants or research.gov to track progress against your SMART objectives. Another key compliance point under 2 CFR 200.341 in this case is the requirement to report significant developments. So you must immediately notify the agency of any problems, delays, or even positive events that enable you to meet milestones sooner than anticipated. This level of transparency protects your credibility and the institution's status, right? So that's a key word there, is to be transparent. Right. So the biggest issue, at least that I've seen in my career, and I suspect me and my colleagues would concur in my judgment here, but the issue is not that a proposal is written one way and then your project is done in some key facets another way. It's doing those things without giving your funder the proper knowledge about what's happening, why it's happening, and what you plan to do to properly notify the funder of these changes. So again, think about what you're doing, what things may need to change midway through, and your staff, your Office of Sponsor Program staff will be well suited to help you to communicate these changes. So again, transparency in this case is key. All right. So let's think about some rules of the road when we think about post-award compliance. So as we wrap up today's session and we think about these rules of the road, let's remember that everything we do is governed by 2 CFR 200 or Federal Uniform Guidance. Remember that this is the grants Bible, let's say, or foundational text that defines the administrative requirements for how you manage these taxpayer funds. And before I move forward, I think I'm going to come out of the presentation for the moment and actually take you to 2 CFR 200. So let's go here. And I think it's worth just seeing what this looks like. So let's search here. And you'll see the Code of Federal Regulations. Pardon me for saying catalog in that previous session, but again, this is called the Code of Federal Regulations. And this online interface is called eCFR, right? So there's a lot of federal regulations. Basically what the Code of Federal Regulations does, and it's worth reflecting on this as we conclude this presentation, but it's a function of the National Archives and Records Administration. And remember that when a law is passed, or the basic way to think about this is when a law is passed, remember that that law has to be reflected, it has significant regulatory implications somehow in this code, right? And so when it comes to cost principles and audit requirements and other things that reflect on federal awards, 2 CFR Part 200 is listed here and it has a number of provisions therein, as you can see here. But these will help you to understand if there is a question about what you should be doing. It's all listed here, and it's worth using this tool to understand and reflect on what are some of the responsibilities that you have as a federal awardee. Now, I don't share this with you as a way to overwhelm you, far from it, but just remember that this is available and that when you interact with your Office of Sponsored Program staff, which is much more familiar with these requirements, you'll be able to much more finely tailor your questions to them and be able to move on and get the kind of resolution that you need. So again, here's a look at this website, and I hope it's helpful as you move forward. In terms of the URL, if you go to ecfr.gov, you'll be able to find this no issue. Let's go back to the proposal in our final slide for this particular presentation. Okay. So again, we talked about federal uniform guidance. Let's further continue our thoughts in terms of rules of the road here as you move forward. And consider that your institution must maintain strict financial management standards. This includes internal controls that align with federal standards to provide reasonable assurance that you are managing the award in compliance with statutes, right? So basically, this means when an institution is deemed viable to receive federal funding, one of the areas that makes that entity, in this case your institution, viable is that they have been subject to some form of an internal audit. They've been subjected to, again, these internal procedural improvements that result in these kinds of internal financial controls that make sure that if you receive funding, that your institution can manage it appropriately and make sure that they have the tools in place to actually receive the money. So it's not good enough to, for example, I guess a good, not analogy, but basically a sort of image in your mind is that, you know, you can't just set up a bank account. You have to have, in this case, a series of policies that the funder feels comfortable that you're not only receiving the money, but that you're using it appropriately. So that's when we think about these financial management standards. They're making sure that, again, you are appropriately situated to receive federal funding. So that being said, one rule PIs often forget is record retention. So all grant records, including your technical data and financial documentation, they must be retained for 3 years from the date of your final report submission. So in other words, if the federal government has to come back and ask you questions about the nature of your grant and what you performed and some of your paperwork, you'll want to make sure that your Office of Sponsor Programs keeps this information. And that's a part of what I mentioned previously in terms of internal controls, like being able to uh, retain some of those records is really of high import. So again, as you reflect on your institutions and their ability to maintain records, right? And each institution is different in terms of how they approach this particular task. It's something, in the case of grants, it is required, right, for this 3 year time span. So just um, be uh, be focused on the fact that everything doesn't just go away by the time that you submit your final report, right? So think of it in those terms. So as we conclude, I want us finally to be made aware of audit readiness, right? So think of it this way. If your institution spends $1 million or more in federal funds annually, it is subject to what's called a single audit to ensure consistent and responsible management. So basically, there are different kinds of audits. A single audit, as mentioned here, is in direct relationship to how much you receive in federal funds. And in this case, from a financial perspective, there's a sort of positive correlation between if you receive more in the way of federal funds, then you'll be subject to this single audit as a way to maintain consistency when it comes to managing those funds over the long term. So again, think about the ways in which your institution is not only keeping financial standards, but is also, and when we think about an audit in this case, we're thinking about making sure that the institution is up on its policies and following through on those policies. It's a way of looking retrospectively on what you have done. So, so just note, as your portfolio grows, the nature of your audit will change. So that being said, I'd like to conclude our session 4. So thank you for joining me. In our final session, we'll talk about what we call prospect research or funding prospect research and how to keep the momentum going for your next big project. Stay tuned to that. Looking forward to seeing you then.